March 2018, a team of historians was conducting a routine archaeological survey near the remote Nevada County foothills when their ground-penetrating radar detected something extraordinary beneath what appeared to be virgin forest floor. The readings showed a perfect grid pattern extending for several city blocks, streets, building foundations, and infrastructure that suggested a substantial community had once thrived in this isolated mountain valley. But when they cross-referenced the coordinates with historical records, mining claims, and century-old maps, they found something that made no sense. According to every official document they could locate, no town had ever existed at these coordinates, yet the physical evidence was undeniable. As they began careful excavation, they uncovered sidewalks made from locally quarried granite, the remains of sophisticated hydraulic mining equipment, and personal artifacts that dated to the peak of California's gold rush in the 1850s and 1860s. Most intriguingly, they found evidence of a substantial Chinese settlement, ceramic fragments, cooking implements, and coins that told the story of a thriving immigrant community that had simply vanished from historical memory. What the team had discovered was just one example of a phenomenon that challenges our understanding of California's gold rush history. While tourist destinations like Columbia and Nevada City preserve the romanticized version of mining boom towns, scattered throughout the Sierra Nevada foothills are the remains of communities that have been completely erased from popular memory, places where thousands of people once lived, worked, and built their dreams before economic collapse, natural disasters, or deliberate destruction left nothing but archaeological traces hidden beneath decades of forest growth. You're watching Undiscovered America, where we explore overlooked corners of the country that most maps and travel guides won't show you. Today, we'll journey into the forgotten California, where gold rush towns tell stories that complicate the familiar narrative of 49ers and frontier prosperity, revealing communities that were deliberately excluded from the myth-making, places that were destroyed by forces beyond their control, and settlements that were simply abandoned so completely that even their names have been lost to time. These aren't just historical curiosities or tourist attractions. They're reminders that the California Gold Rush created and destroyed far more communities than most people realize, and that the familiar stories we tell about this period often obscure more complex truths about who prospered, who suffered, and what was lost when the gold ran out. Number 7, Chinese Camp. Chinese Camp still appears on some maps, but what exists today is a tiny remnant of what was once one of California's largest Chinese communities, deliberately destroyed during the anti-Chinese violence of the 1870s and 1880s. At its peak in the 1860s, Chinese Camp housed over 5,000 residents, making it one of the most substantial settlements in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The community had developed its own economic infrastructure, with Chinese-owned businesses, temples, schools, and social organizations that served not just local residents, but Chinese miners scattered throughout the gold country. But Chinese Camp's prosperity made it a target during the wave of anti-Chinese sentiment that swept California in the post-Civil War period. In 1876, a series of arson attacks destroyed most of the business district. Local authorities not only failed to investigate these crimes, but actively discouraged Chinese residents from rebuilding by refusing to issue construction permits and denying police protection. What makes Chinese Camp's destruction particularly systematic is how thoroughly the community's history was erased from local records. Newspaper accounts of the town's prosperity were removed from archived collections. Business licenses and property records were destroyed or lost. Even cemetery records were altered to minimize evidence of the large Chinese population that had once lived there. Today, Chinese Camp consists of a few dozen residents and some restored buildings that represent only a fraction of the original community. The visitor center focuses on the town's role as a supply depot for nearby mining operations, with minimal mention of the thriving Chinese community that was its primary reason for existence. Walking through modern Chinese Camp, it's almost impossible to imagine that this quiet crossroads was once home to one of the largest Chinese populations outside San Francisco. Archaeological surveys of the area continue to uncover evidence of the destroyed community. Foundation stones from buildings that were never rebuilt, artifacts from Chinese households and businesses, and traces of the sophisticated infrastructure that supported thousands of residents. But this physical evidence of Chinese Camp's significance remains largely hidden from public view, buried beneath decades of deliberate historical amnesia. Number 6. Rough and Ready. Rough and Ready achieved brief fame for declaring independence from the United States in 1850. But what's forgotten is how the town's unique political experiment was destroyed by outside economic forces that turned a thriving community into a cautionary tale about corporate power. Rough and Ready was founded in 1849 by a group of miners from Wisconsin who were determined to create a democratic community where decisions would be made collectively and profits would be shared equitably among all residents. For several years, this experiment appeared to be succeeding. The town prospered, disputes were resolved through community meetings, and residents enjoyed a level of economic equality that was rare in Gold Rush, California. The Declaration of Independence was a protest against federal mining taxes that the community felt were unjust, but it also represented something more significant, an attempt to create an alternative to the increasingly corporate-dominated mining industry that was squeezing out individual miners throughout the gold country. But Rough and Ready's success attracted the attention of large mining companies that saw the town's democratic practices and profit-sharing arrangements as a threat to their business model. Through a combination of legal challenges, economic pressure, and political manipulation, these companies systematically undermined the town's independence. The final blow came when outside investors gained control of the most productive mining claims around Rough and Ready through a series of questionable legal maneuvers. Once corporate interests controlled the local economy, the community's democratic institutions collapsed, and residents were forced to accept wage labor under conditions they had previously rejected. By the 1860s, Rough and Ready had been transformed from an experiment in democratic mining into a conventional company town. The community institutions that had made it unique were dismantled, and many of the original residents left for other opportunities. Today, Rough and Ready exists as a small, unincorporated community with a little evidence of its radical political origins. Number 5. Malakoff Diggins. Malakoff Diggins is now a state park preserving the environmental devastation caused by hydraulic mining. But hidden within the tourist attraction are the remains of several substantial communities that were literally washed away by the mining operations they had been built to support. Hydraulic mining used high-pressure water cannons to blast away entire hillsides, washing gold-bearing gravel through massive sluice systems. This technique was incredibly destructive to the environment, but it was also incredibly profitable, and it supported several boom towns that grew up around the major hydraulic operations in Nevada County. The town of North Bloomfield was the largest of these communities, housing over 2,000 people at its peak in the 1870s. The town had all the infrastructure of a substantial settlement: hotels, restaurants, saloons, a school, churches, and dozens of businesses that served both local residents and the thousands of miners who worked the hydraulic operations. But hydraulic mining was inherently unsustainable. The technique destroyed the very landscape it depended on, and the massive amounts of mining debris washed downstream, causing floods and environmental damage that eventually led to legal challenges and government regulation. When hydraulic mining was banned in 1884, the communities that depended on it collapsed almost overnight. North Bloomfield and the other settlements around Malakoff Diggins were abandoned so quickly that residents often left personal belongings behind, expecting to return when legal challenges to the mining ban were resolved. What makes Malakoff Diggins particularly haunting is how the landscape itself tells the story of destruction. The massive pits carved by hydraulic mining operations remain visible today, but scattered around these environmental scars are the foundation stones, rusted machinery, and personal artifacts of the communities that were sacrificed to create them. Today, visitors to Malakoff Diggins State Park can see both the environmental devastation and the human cost of hydraulic mining. The park preserves some buildings from North Bloomfield, but most of the evidence of the thriving communities that once existed here has been washed away by the same forces that created the gold that built them. Number 4. Mokelumne Hill. Mokelumne Hill was once known as one of the richest and most cosmopolitan towns in the Mother Lode, but a series of catastrophic fires and the exhaustion of easily accessible gold deposits left it a shadow of its former prosperity. During its heyday in the 1850s, Mokelumne Hill was home to over 15,000 people, representing dozens of nationalities and ethnic groups. The town was famous for its tolerance and diversity. Chinese, Mexican, Chilean, French, and American miners worked alongside each other in an atmosphere of relative cooperation that was unusual in Gold Rush, California. The town's prosperity was built on some of the richest placer gold deposits in the Sierra Nevada. Claims around Mokelumne Hill produced enormous amounts of gold, and the town became a regional center for banking, supply, and entertainment that served mining operations throughout Calaveras County. But Mokelumne Hill's wooden buildings and narrow streets made it vulnerable to fire, and a series of devastating blazes in the 1850s and 1860s repeatedly destroyed large sections of the town. Each fire was followed by rebuilding efforts, but the costs of reconstruction gradually exhausted the community's resources. The final blow came when the easily accessible gold deposits were exhausted and mining operations moved to other areas. Without the economic foundation provided by gold mining, Mokelumne Hill couldn't sustain its large population, and the town began a slow but steady decline. What makes Mokelumne Hill's decline particularly poignant is how much evidence remains of its former prosperity. Walking through the town today, you can see the stone foundations of buildings that were never rebuilt after the final fires. Elaborate Victorian houses that were abandoned when their owners left for other opportunities, and commercial buildings that were simply boarded up when the businesses they housed failed. Unlike some gold rush towns that have been completely restored for tourism, Mokelumne Hill preserves a sense of authentic decay that makes it possible to imagine what the town's decline must have felt like for the residents who lived through it. The empty lots where grand hotels once stood, the overgrown cemeteries where diverse communities buried their dead, and the remnants of mining equipment scattered through the surrounding hills all tell the story of a community that was too successful for its own sustainability. Number 3. French Gulch. French Gulch was established by French miners who brought sophisticated hydraulic techniques to California. But the community was gradually abandoned as anti-foreign sentiment, and discriminatory mining laws made it impossible for immigrant miners to compete with American operations. French miners who came to California during the gold rush brought technical expertise that was often superior to the crude methods used by most American prospectors. They understood hydraulic engineering, had experience with industrial mining techniques, and were willing to invest in expensive equipment that could extract gold more efficiently than simple panning or sluicing. French Gulch became a center for this advanced mining technology. With sophisticated water management systems, carefully engineered sluices, and mining techniques that allowed the community to extract gold from claims that other miners had considered exhausted. But the success of French miners attracted resentment from American prospectors who found themselves outcompeted by immigrant communities with superior technical knowledge. Beginning in the 1850s, California passed a series of discriminatory laws designed to drive foreign miners out of the gold fields. The foreign miners' tax imposed heavy fees on non-American miners, while local regulations often prevented immigrant communities from filing claims or purchasing mining equipment. French Gulch residents found themselves facing not just economic discrimination, but physical intimidation from American miners who resented their success. As legal and economic pressure mounted, French miners began leaving California for other opportunities. Some returned to France, others moved to mining regions in other states or countries, and a few stayed in California but abandoned mining for other occupations. By the 1870s, French Gulch was largely abandoned. The sophisticated mining infrastructure that had made the community successful was dismantled or left to decay, and the houses and businesses that had served the French mining community were either demolished or simply left empty. Today, French Gulch exists as a small rural community with little evidence of its origins as a center for advanced mining technology. The water management systems, mining equipment, and other infrastructure that represented the technical sophistication of French miners have largely disappeared, leaving only scattered archaeological evidence of what was once one of the most innovative mining communities in California. Number 2. Volcano was one of the most prosperous towns in the Mother Lode during the 1850s, but it was gradually abandoned as deep shaft mining replaced placer operations and the community's economic foundation shifted to industrial operations that required fewer workers. Despite its ominous name, Volcano was actually named for its setting in a bowl-shaped valley that early miners thought resembled a volcanic crater. During its peak years, the town was home to over 5,000 people and boasted amenities that rivaled much larger cities, including California's first lending library, one of the state's first little theater groups, and the first astronomical observatory in the Mother Lode. Volcano's prosperity was built on extraordinarily rich placer deposits that could be worked profitably using simple techniques available to individual miners. The town became a supply center for hundreds of small mining operations scattered throughout the surrounding hills, creating a diverse economy that included everything from banking and legal services to entertainment and education. But as the surface gold was exhausted, mining operations around Volcano shifted to deep shaft techniques that required substantial capital investment and industrial-scale operations. This transition eliminated the economic opportunities that had supported thousands of individual miners and small businesses. The shift to industrial mining also meant that most of the gold extracted from the area was shipped directly to San Francisco rather than being processed and traded locally. Volcano lost its role as a regional commercial center, and businesses that had thrived during the placer mining era found themselves without customers. What makes Volcano's decline particularly dramatic is how quickly it occurred. Census records show that the town's population dropped from over 5,000 in 1860 to fewer than 500 by 1870. Buildings that had housed thriving businesses were abandoned, and entire neighborhoods were simply left empty as residents moved away. Today, Volcano is a small community that preserves some historic buildings but gives little sense of its former importance. The St. George Hotel, which once hosted elaborate social events for the region's mining elite, still operates but serves a handful of tourists rather than the hundreds of guests it accommodated during the town's heyday. Walking through modern Volcano, it's difficult to imagine that this quiet rural community was once one of the cultural and commercial centers of Gold Rush, California. The empty lots where grand buildings once stood, the overgrown foundations of abandoned houses, and the remnants of mining infrastructure scattered through the surrounding hills are the only evidence of a community that was too dependent on a single industry to survive its transformation. Number 1, Shasta. Shasta was known as the Queen City of the Northern Mines and served as the commercial capital for gold mining operations throughout Northern California. But it was completely bypassed when the railroad chose a different route, turning one of the state's most important cities into a ghost town almost overnight. During the 1850s and 1860s, Shasta was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in California. Located at the northern end of the Central Valley, it served as the supply center for mining operations scattered throughout the Klamath Mountains, the Cascade Range, and the northern Sierra Nevada. Pack trains carrying supplies to remote mining camps departed from Shasta daily, and the town's merchants became wealthy, providing everything from mining equipment to luxury goods for successful prospectors. Shasta's main street was lined with elaborate brick buildings that housed banks, hotels, theaters, and businesses that served not just local residents, but customers from throughout Northern California. The town had multiple newspapers, several churches, a variety of social organizations, and cultural amenities that reflected its importance as a regional center. But Shasta's prosperity was entirely dependent on its role as a transportation hub, and that role was threatened when the Central Pacific Railroad began planning its route through Northern California in the 1870s. Town leaders were confident that the railroad would pass through Shasta, given the city's importance and existing infrastructure. Instead, the railroad chose a route that bypassed Shasta entirely, establishing a new terminus at Redding, several miles to the east. This decision was based on engineering considerations. The terrain around Redding was better suited for railroad construction, but it doomed Shasta to economic irrelevance. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within just a few years of the railroad's completion, most of Shasta's businesses had either moved to Redding or simply closed. The pack train operations that had been the foundation of the town's economy were replaced by railroad freight, and Shasta lost its function as a transportation center. By 1890, Shasta's population had dropped from over 3,500 to fewer than 500. The elaborate brick buildings that had housed thriving businesses stood empty, and entire blocks of the town were simply abandoned. Some buildings were dismantled and their materials shipped to other communities, but most were simply left to decay. Today, Shasta State Historic Park preserves some of the town's ruins, but these represent only a small fraction of what was once one of California's most important cities. The courthouse, a few commercial buildings, and scattered foundations are all that remain of a community that was too dependent on a single economic function to survive technological change. And what makes Shasta's decline particularly striking is how completely a major city could disappear when its economic foundation was eliminated. The ruins scattered through the park give some sense of the town's former importance, but they can't convey the scale of a community that was once home to thousands of people and served as the commercial center for a region larger than many states. So what do these 7 forgotten gold rush towns tell us about California's history and about the forces that determined which communities survived and which were lost to time? First, there's the realization that the familiar story of gold rush prosperity obscures the experiences of many communities that were systematically excluded from economic opportunities or destroyed by forces beyond their control. Chinese Camp, French Gulch, and other immigrant communities faced deliberate discrimination that erased not just their prosperity, but their memory from historical records. Second, there's the vulnerability of communities that were too dependent on a single economic activity. When gold deposits were exhausted, mining techniques changed or transportation routes shifted, entire towns could disappear within a few years, leaving behind only archaeological evidence of their former existence. Third, there's the role that technological and economic change played in determining which communities survived. Towns like Shasta and Volcano were prosperous and important during the placer mining era, but they couldn't adapt when industrial mining and railroad transportation transformed the economic landscape of California. But perhaps most importantly, these forgotten towns remind us that the California we know today was built on the foundation of countless communities that didn't survive the transition from gold rush boom to modern economy. The empty foundations hidden in Sierra Nevada forests, the scattered artifacts that archaeologists continue to discover, and the occasional historical marker that mentions a town that no longer exists, all serve as reminders that the past was far more complex and diverse than the simplified stories we typically tell about it. These 7 abandoned places represent just the communities we know about, those that left enough evidence for historians and archaeologists to reconstruct their stories. How many other gold rush towns disappeared so completely that we don't even know their names? How many other experiments in democratic mining, immigrant communities, and alternative economic arrangements were destroyed or abandoned without leaving any trace in historical memory? The California Gold Rush created more than just the familiar tourist destinations that preserve sanitized versions of frontier life. It created hundreds of communities where people from around the world came together to build new lives, experiment with different ways of organizing society, and pursue dreams that often ended in disappointment or disaster. Understanding these forgotten towns doesn't diminish the legitimate achievements of Gold Rush California, but it does complicate the familiar narrative of inevitable progress and shared prosperity. The goldfields were places of both opportunity and exploitation, innovation and destruction, success and failure. And the towns that didn't survive tell stories that are just as important as those that did.